Welcome. My name is Cliff Johnson, and I'm going to be moderating our little discussion up here. I'm hoping that won't involve much because you guys are all going to participate a whole lot and make it a great panel. What I'm going to do is start us off by having each person on the panel here introduce themselves quickly, including myself, who we are, what we do, what organization we're working with, and maybe just quickly how we're connected to University of Chicago. And then I'm going to hand it over to you guys to ask questions. I've got other questions here, so if you guys are strangely silent, I'll kick in with those, but I'm hoping you guys will jump right in. There's going to be a microphone standing over here in that part of the room, and you can just walk on up there and, line up behind it. I know it's tempting to just stand up and yell, but what will happen is inevitably someone will not hear your question. They'll only hear the answer, and that can get confusing for folks. So if you would just line up over there to ask your questions, that would be fantastic. All right? Thanks, everybody. I'm going to let James down there at the far end start, and then we'll just work our way back here.
Okay.
Great. Thanks.
Good afternoon. My name is Jim Fristup. I'm now at the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. Supposed to be speaking about international relations. My international relations career has been essentially Washington-based at the Institute now, which is a really unique institution. We have about 30 associates. We work on national strategic issues. The guy who signs our paycheck is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's almost like being at the University of Chicago. They ask you questions to which there are no real answers, and you give it your best shot and move on. I've also I've run the gamut in terms of foreign policy in Washington, D.C. I was the director of the Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation. I served on the policy planning staff in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. I worked for Secretary Shultz and Secretary Baker on the planning staff at the Department of State. I worked for IBM for a couple of years as the program manager for government relations in the Asia-Pacific region. And I began my career in Washington on Capitol Hill, which is still one of the great places, I think, to work in Washington, D.C., and wound up on the Foreign Affairs Committee. And so for the last 30 years, I've been basically working on the Asia-Pacific region, U.S. relations with Japan and Korea in particular. I'll pass it on.
Hi, I'm Margaret Youngs. I am a program manager at Opportunity International, a leading microfinance organization that builds banks and other kinds of organizations in the developing world. As a program manager, I manage a big portfolio of projects primarily in Africa and all of our projects in Asia. I manage about $2 million of my own grant monies, and I also am responsible for almost 30 plus million of other dollars that go out the door, but are not necessarily specifically tied to a grant. I am a graduate of the Harris School of Public Policy. I graduated a couple years ago, so I'm the resident newbie on the panel. And I guess that's really all I have to say.
You haven't had your midlife crisis yet.
I kind of did, because I'm going on a big trip to Ethiopia soon. So.
Good afternoon. My name is Chris Sandrolini. I got my undergraduate degree here at Chicago in 1982. Went on to get a master's degree in international relations in Washington, and then I joined the State Department in 1984 and have been there ever since. I'm a Foreign Service officer, have served about half the time in Washington and the rest of the time overseas in the Dominican Republic, Slovakia, twice in India, once in Italy, once in Jerusalem, and back in Washington now. There are a whole lot of things that I would like to tell you all about Foreign Service careers or State Department careers. That would take a lot more time than I have at the moment. I do want to just make one quick plug, though, and then we'll do questions later. I brought along a couple of boxes worth of materials which some of you all might find useful. This is student internship information, internships available in foreign affairs at the State Department. You can find it, of course, if you look on the web, and they're in the back, thank you. You can find it on the web if you just type in careers.state.gov or just State Department internships. You'll find it anyway. But there are some handy booklets here, and looking forward to your questions later. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jerry Hyman. I am as confused now as I was when I was your age, and have had a checkered career. I suppose the basis of the question in my particular story, which is quite quixotic, is the question that Aristotle asks in the Nicomachean Ethics: what is it to mean a good life, and what does happiness consist of? In my own case, it's sort of been a checkered career. As I said, I began, like all University of Chicago students in those days, thinking that the only good life was to be an academic, puzzled over questions that have no answers, etc. So I was a college professor for about 10 years, and then I went to law school, and I practiced law for a while, and then I went into the U.S. Agency for International Development. All these have deep meaning stories behind them, which I'm sure you're interested in. And now I'm at a think tank, which is a kind of a research institute. And each one of these steps were non-teleological. That is, I would have had no idea at any one of those steps that's where I would have wound up. So for those of you who have anxiety about what your future is going to look like and what are we going to plan and how are we going to strategize to get there, at least in my own case, it's been accident as well as planning and taking advantage of accidents that happen to come along, which has had some very positive dimensions and also some costs. And the costs are in security, personal security. How do I know what I'm going to be doing? Financial security, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which maybe we can get into later on in the discussion. Not so much about me, but about the issue, which will affect all of you. So I went through the college. I did a master's and PhD at the University of Chicago. I grew up in Chicago, so that gives you some idea of how much of my life I spent at the Quadrangle, and then left and as I've gone through this career that I just mentioned to you. And so maybe my own career is a lesson in uncertainty.
I'm not sure how to follow up that one. Hello? Am I on? I said it's dangerous to give me a mic, and it truly is. I'm Jeremy Page. I have my own law firm called Page Fewer PC. We do international trade and customs. It's all import, export, supply chain security, all these sexy terms. My connection to university is nowhere near as deep as his. I actually had been practicing law for a while, went back, got my MBA along the way, because what I do is very business oriented. So understanding at our lunch discussion, we were talking a little about understanding all the nuances and dynamics of business is essential to what I do as a practitioner. I've been doing this for, 25 years. It's 25. Right about now, I started working at Arthur Andersen in their tax department. So 25 years ago, and my own firm for about 2.5 years. So I'm going to talk, I guess, at some point or another, if you have any questions about international trade, international law. I know there's a separate legal session, so we won't make it too law-like. We'll make it more international trade-like. So, and you?
All right. My name is Cliff Johnson. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a recruitment coordinator for Peace Corps for the Midwest region. So I work here in Chicago, finding folks like you to go spend a couple years and do service. And that's what I did after I graduated from the University of Chicago. I did a master's degree at the Social Service Administration program. And shortly after that, my wife and I joined Peace Corps and went to the Kingdom of Tonga for 27 months, which is a very different place than Chicago, not only in climate on a day like today, but in culture and many other regards. And then came back and started working for the recruitment office and have been there for 5 or 6 years now. So my background is primarily in social work domestically, but then over the last 5 or 6 years have pushed more and more into international development work. And I've had the opportunity also to meet with folks at Peace Corps about our strategies as an agency moving into our next 50 years as we celebrate our anniversary this year. So that's me. I'm going to ask that you guys feel free to jump up to the microphone and ask questions. If you can't hear us, raise your hand and let us know so that we can adjust our microphones accordingly and let you guys know who we are. And also, if you have questions that are directed to one person specifically, feel free to state that when you ask your question. I know that Chris brought some materials about the State Department. I also have some materials about Peace Corps up here. I don't have boxes worth, and perhaps that's reflective of our two departments' budgets. I'm going to try not to have an inferiority complex about that, but you know, it might happen anyway. So file on up to the microphone and let us know what questions you have.
Well, that's easy. We can go home.
All right. Wow. We went around the world in 10 minutes, folks. We're amazing. Anybody? Okay. Let me go ahead and throw out a question for you guys, if that's okay. I'll get us started that way. If that sounds all right to everybody. I am curious to what extent, for folks here, their time at University of Chicago or as an undergraduate impacted the next 5 to 10 years of their career path after that. I mean, how much did you know where you were going to be heading? I know you've already talked a little bit about the uncertainty for you over your career. How much did you know where you were going to be heading when you were at this point of folks in this room right now? And I'll open that up to anybody.
Well, I'll take a shot at it. I graduated, my PhD was in 1975, and it was a equally bleak employment year that year for graduates coming out. There were 3 jobs that I interviewed for. One of them was something like Central Colorado State College in Gunnison, Colorado. So I went to the Regenstein and looked up where this place was, where Gunnison, Colorado is. And it's right in the middle of the mountains. And I said, well, Chicago's 6 months of snow. This looks like 9. I think there are better options. So I packed up the car. I was always interested in the interaction between politics and diplomacy, foreign policy. It came out of my own family's background at the end of the Second World War. From the eastern part of Poland, is now part of Ukraine, and we've changed citizenships. But it affected my family. And so I was always interested in this nexus between politics and policy. I came to Washington and went to work on Capitol Hill as a staffer for Congressman Lucian Nedzi from Detroit, my home congressman. My PhD was in Asian studies. I was basically doing Social Security checks and transportation issues for the congressman. But I thought about using it as kind of a baseline. They were paying me, and I thought that, okay, that's great. I can use that as the next step to find a job that I'm really interested in. So I used to do translations of Japanese articles that appeared in the Japanese press, Japanese newspapers, magazines, and run them up to the Foreign Affairs, Foreign Relations Committee and say, hey, did you guys look at this? It was a way of trying to build a network. So when a staff opening happened, someone said, hey, what about this guy? And that's the way I started. And then, as I said, I wound up at the State Department and right across the board in Washington, D.C. Absolutely all happenstance.
I can chip in as well, just like Jerry also said. I mean, in my case, I had no idea really what I wanted to do in college, which is why I was a general studies and humanities major, because then I didn't have to make as many choices. I could take whatever I wanted. And that was my guiding philosophy pretty much since then till now. In the Foreign Service, there's a pretty easy path. If you can either specialize or you can remain more of a generalist, and I've certainly remained more of that. But I can also say that I really had no idea, and I more or less accidentally got into the Foreign Service. I signed up to take the exam with a number of friends, and I passed the various stages, and by the time I finished my graduate degree, there was a job open, so I didn't feel like turning it down. I guess that the point of saying that is that for me at least, and I would encourage those of you who feel similarly, the world is full of new opportunities and change. And if you don't know exactly what you want to do at any time, you can make choices, and then there's more than one right choice that can be made. I certainly feel I could have done other things and been happy at that, but I've been very pleased with what I have done. And I think as long as you keep your eyes open, there are a lot of opportunities in many directions. So I did not have anything like a very fixed career path myself.
Sounds like we have a lot in common.
But I just want to comment on
sure.
that, because I think this very important point that Chris makes is that you look at the Foreign Service as a career. There's a lot of stability involved. And so when you think about how do you want to manage your life, there's certainly stability in that. I had a different take on it completely. I couldn't see myself being a bureaucrat for 25 or 30 years. I said, that's just not for me. But I think you really have to appreciate the degree of stability and security that the Foreign Service provides. And it's a great career, and there's just great opportunities across the board.
Although best started with Peace Corps, of course. Why don't we go over there? Looks like we have a question or an announcement. You are moving the microphone. Where are you taking it, Michelle?
Middle, right in front of us.
This is like a Google search.
Assuming you all are dying.
Oh, now you're gonna really put it on them. They have to come up to the mic.
Does anyone have any questions? Oh, we got someone hopping up. They're probably just going to the bathroom. It's all going to be disappointing. Hey, applause. First person.
Slowly, he makes his way to the microphone.
That's fine.
No, just talk to the microphone. That's fine. Then everyone will hear you.
My question is, for a career in international relations, what are the relative benefits of being posted overseas versus being in, say, Washington? I mean, if you're interested in being a diplomat, do you have to go to some other country, or is it equally beneficial to stay in the States?
Aiming for a diplomat, that's pretty good.
I got my take on it, but I'll let you take
Well,
a first shot at it.
Let me say something about it real quickly. To be a foreign service officer, of course, you do have to be prepared to go overseas. That career leads a lot of opportunities to change. In other words, you can spend most of your time overseas and some in Washington, or you can do the reverse and spend most of your time in Washington and some overseas. But generally speaking, you do have to be prepared to spend at least a fair portion of it overseas. I should note, though, that the State Department is not only the Foreign Service. There's also the Civil Service, and there are various specialties within both the Foreign and Civil Service. The Civil Service is almost exclusively domestic, but increasingly there are opportunities for Civil Service officers to spend at least one rotation or sometimes more overseas. So the nature of our work is evolving somewhat. And for those of you who are interested, I would certainly suggest you take a look at the QDDR, which has just been released, which is the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review. It's a Hillary Clinton special. It is patterned after a defense model, and it's supposed to happen every 4 years. It has a lot of good information about the directions that she thinks the State Department should be moving in, and I think actually many of those are a very good idea. It's about more flexibility, about more whole of government work. It's about more employment, more creatively employing people for short periods of time, bringing them in from other walks of life, etc. So the degree of exclusivity that used to apply to the Foreign Service is diminishing now.
I just want to follow on that because I think that was a very good question. To my mind, it raised the central issue that I try to deal with in thinking about a career in terms of the Foreign Service or in policy, and that is that, from my perspective at least, it takes a long time for a Foreign Service officer to get really into key policy positions. There's a lot of reporting. It goes on back and forth from the embassies and managing relations back in Washington. But in terms of key policy decisions, it takes a very long time, from my perspective. And perhaps I'm wrong on that, but that's the way I thought about it. And I was much more interested in policy per se. And so there's a second track to international relations in Washington, and that's the political track. And that's where I started. House Foreign Affairs Committee. I wound up running a presidential commission on U.S.-Japan, deputy director of the U.S.-Japan Presidential Commission of the White House in 1984, thanks to a classmate, Paul Wolfowitz. And then I served with Secretary Shultz and Secretary Baker. And then President Clinton was elected. And, of course, I was fired. And so that's part of the instability you deal with. And those are the kind of trade-offs you have to think about, in my mind, between access to policy decision-making. When I worked for Secretary Baker, the policy planning staff, I think, historically, there are two great directors. One was George Kennan, the second was Dennis Ross. And we had direct access to the secretary. It was one stop, the paper went into Dennis, and then it went on to the secretary. That was a very heady experience. And so those are the things you have to think about balancing, because, again, if your man loses, you're gone. And that's the reality you have to live with. So it all depends. Risk tolerance is a critical issue when you think about going to Washington and working in Washington. What's your risk tolerance?
To take it in practical terms, if you want to do international, you have to be international. You can't be in the United States alone. You'll never do it, because you need to be exposed to cultures. You need to be exposed to risk, a different type of risk than uncertainty or administrative change. I mean, administrative change, just so everybody's clear, administrative change happens when you're a political appointee. When you're like a regular working guy, they don't throw out the whole shop. So don't think that that's something that happens the day you join, that you're at risk at that level immediately. But you need to go out and see the world. And I know that's trite, and I know the world's shrinking and all that good stuff, but it's really true. And so it's essential that whether it's opportunities to travel, study abroad, volunteer. I mean, his resume is incredible, the different things he's done to work with groups. Some of them were here. Some weren't overseas. They're working with, refugees and other people who came from other places, but it still exposed you to another culture. I mean, it is essential that you do that, because you cannot have any appreciation for what you might face in the world or what other people are facing and the differences in their culture to yours unless you do it firsthand. So somehow get the opportunity. I mean, my fire was lit when I backpacked through Europe after college, for like 2 months on a shoestring. And that was awesome because you were exposed to people. Now, Europe's a developed place. It's a lot easier to go to than many other places. But you know what? It lit a fire for me to appreciate more so what's out there. And I'm old enough that I still use typewriters and there was no internet. So, so what I knew were 4 TV channels, it's true. And then cable started when I was in college. So, different world, but you need to do it. I mean, that's the only way you're really going to get the ability to build a resume and to build the credibility in a different level, both internally and externally, that you can really, or have a true interest and a devotion to international relations, studies, whatever you want to call it.
You started on my question actually a little bit and then stopped. I was wondering if you guys could discuss your experiences abroad, since that's such an important part of being in international relations.
Well, I spent 3 years in Japan, and I think looking back on it, it was, I wrote my mom, I said, I think it's as close as I can come to the moon and still be on the Earth, because everything was 180 degrees, polar opposite from the way you grew up. It's things that worked here didn't work there, and you had to understand why they didn't work. And I think ultimately at the end of that experience, 2 things. One, I learned about another culture, and I learned about myself and my culture and reflecting back on it. And I think those are just invaluable experiences. My son has spent the last year in Japan teaching English on a program sponsored by the Japanese Foreign Ministry and the Ministry of Education, and he had exactly the same experience. He said, they tell you one thing, it just doesn't work that way. So you have to experience it yourself. And I think it's invaluable.
Well, my experience abroad as an academic, I was an anthropology major, as I think I mentioned to you, in graduate school. So I spent not quite 2 years in an extremely tiny little, not even quite village in Malaysia. I had opportunity to have lunch with the Malaysian ambassador last year, and he didn't even know where this place was. So, but he'd heard about it. So, and then I spent a year in Japan, but much later in my career, I was at the time a college faculty member, so it was a junior year abroad, but I was learning about Japan and Japanese. So I spent 3 years, I guess I would say, abroad. One quick thing about Chris's thing, though, the civil service is much more stable part of the. We're only talking now about the State Department, which is a minor sliver of all of these possible things in international world, and so you can do that. But that's not the highest levels of the State Department are not often filled by civil servants. They're filled either by Foreign Service officers or by political appointees. So the trade-off there between stability of Washington, et cetera, is that you're not anywhere near as likely to get to a decision-making position. I think at stage if you're a civil servant. There are a few exceptions to that.
There's more than that.
Margaret, to what extent did you feel like international experience was part of what got you to Opportunity International, or is core to your experience there?
A ton. I think since the day I was born, I wanted to travel, and I didn't even know it. So I studied abroad in France my junior year of college. I had known that I wanted to do that since I was like 5 years old. My mom had done it back before people really did that, and I always wanted to learn another language, and I feel like moving somewhere and living there for a long period of time is truly the only and best way to really learn the language and feel connected and part of it. And it was hard. It was incredibly hard. But for me, I'm from California. Growing up, it was just people kind of assume you're going to learn Spanish because it's useful immediately. But when you learn French, it's kind of like, oh, gee, why would you do that ever? But now that I work in development, it's It's a lovely language, and it's so useful because I work in Africa, and people forget that actually a lot of the countries there, they speak French, so it's immediately useful there. And I'm glad that I went and studied abroad so that I could have that language skill. I attended like the regular university with French students, which was going to school in another country just like them is really hard. Especially their grade system don't really make sense, and it's hard, and you're just like, I'm trying the best I can. But after that experience and traveling around, I definitely was fully committed to wanting to make a difference in the world and knowing that I really wanted to work in development, and public policy kind of plugged into that because it's an amazing skill set that I developed here at Paris School, and it just really works well with what I'm doing now as a program manager. And I travel not as much as I would like, and my boss has promised more, but I travel to Africa quite a lot. I travel on my own. I travel whenever I have dollars, I go abroad. So I'm just really blessed to have started the career. And I mean, they've mentioned it before, but you have to go. You have to go somewhere. You have to live somewhere and challenge yourself. And even if it's not a long trip, you're going to learn so much about yourself, about other people, and you're going to know, can I handle it? Can I imagine myself living somewhere else and, being kind of disconnected from your world? But the truth is, you go back and it's still all there. You just come back and rejoin your old life.
Yeah, and just to chime in on that, of course, for me, living internationally was part of how I learned the marketable language of Tongan, which has had a huge career impact for me. I will say, though, that I think that there are different kinds of international experiences in terms of the extent to which you really get to be integrated at the community level. And that was part of what appealed about Peace Corps, but Peace Corps is hardly the only organization that allows for that. I think that there is an extent to which that integration is not only key to language, but to understanding those cultural differences that we talked about earlier. For me, living on a small island during pre-service training and watching 5 families share one knife was part of how I understood the extent to which private ownership and communal ownership were fundamentally different. And that there was no way I could start a small business program there without understanding some of those fundamental cultural differences. And so it really started with not necessarily being at the level where I could observe quietly from far away, but where I was thrown right into the middle of a small village's life. And sitting there every night at the dinner table was how I saw that. And I think those kinds of opportunities, however you can find them, are not only going to allow you to know what you can handle, but I think they're also going to allow you to really see the cultural differences from the grassroots level. And for me, from a programmatic planning perspective, if you start up here and try to figure out what might work down here, that's a lot different than starting down here and seeing how it works, and then planning backwards, understanding that fundamental reality down there in the field. So I think that can be really helpful for you from a planning perspective too.
In terms of, I guess, all fields, how much of a say do you have in where you go when you go abroad? For example, if you have an interest or even a lot of experience in a language or a region, does that help you, and are you able to use it in your field?
I think this is, again, kind of a Foreign Service question, since anybody who's self-employed is going to have a different, or commercially employed is going to have a different answer to that. But within the government, I also wanted to note that the State Department Foreign Service is not the only foreign service. There is also a commercial foreign service and an agricultural foreign service, and then, of course, the intelligence communities and the Defense Department have their own overseas, and USAID certainly is foreign service overseas aspect. But within my own purview, that's to say State Department Foreign Service, it's a gray zone, meaning you can have a large influence on where you end up, but you can never really know for sure. I spent 20 years trying to get myself to Italy. I have family connections, and never happened. And to my surprise, then I was named the Deputy Chief of Mission at our embassy to the Holy See, which was also something I never anticipated. So you can steer where you go, and you can generally avoid places that you don't want to be, as long as that list is not too large. But it's very difficult to know for certain, where you're going to end up. It's a negotiating process. It's a bidding process. Every time you're finishing one assignment, somewhat before that, you start negotiating with people on where your next one's going to be, and it's like job interviews every 3 years. That's at least a Foreign Service answer.
Yeah, and from Peace Corps, you have even less say than that. I mean, as a federal agency, I mean, my wife and I asked to go to Africa, and we ended up in Tonga. So it's definitely something where we ask for a great deal of flexibility, and that's because of the fact that when you're working with 70 different countries who each have communities and areas that are asking for very specific assistance, we match primarily based on skill set first. So if I can find an organization that needs an environmental educator and someone who has an environmental degree, that's more important to me than whether the person with the environmental degree wants to go to someplace in particular. Because if the place they want to go to really needs someone that can be a carpenter, whether or not they have an environmental education degree doesn't really assist a lot. So we really start primarily from that, what are the host community requests perspective. You can state a preference. We'll factor that preference in if there are multiple regions or areas that have asked for your help. But from there, you've got to be flexible. Margaret, were you going to throw something in?
I was just going to say, for most nonprofits, you can pretty quickly do due diligence and see what countries they work in. And once you're hired someone or somewhere, you definitely already know about the program before it's funded and you're online and you're traveling and going to that. So there's a little less surprises in the nonprofit. They kind of know where you might be headed.
Looks like we have 2 questions waiting here. You want to go ahead?
Sure. How would you say that your international travels affect your decisions on domestic policy?
If I could take a crack at that.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's going to be an oblique answer to your question, but I was thinking about this in response to an earlier question. There's certainly a huge personal impact, I think, for almost anybody, certainly for me, when you spend time overseas, because you are a third grader when you go overseas. Certainly with the language, you're starting from scratch. So, here you are, a smart, successful, high-powered person in your own context, an English-speaking American, for example. And then you go overseas and you're babbling because you don't know how to say all the great thoughts you have in mind. And that applies culturally as well. So unless you're very stubborn and refuse to make this adjustment, I mean, it really calls for tremendous challenges to yourself, which is also very invigorating. It's a mirror to yourself that you get to hold up every time you go overseas again and learn a new culture and realize that, in many cases, these are ancient cultures of tremendous complexity, beauty, subtlety, and you can only begin to scratch the surface. And you also then come back and look at some of the things that you took for granted before. I didn't know that one could do it that way and like it. And you haven't. So you bring that back personally. In terms of policy context, it's a little harder to say. There's a constant dialogue between overseas embassies and the Washington decision makers from all agencies. So there is a lot of feedback. And of course, other countries have their embassies here as well. And there are broader communities that get involved, business communities, political communities, and so forth. But I would say that having lived and served overseas definitely gives you a different dimension of understanding the impact of what we do as the United States. Everything we do is huge around the world. And so having been overseas, sometimes you can see that much more clearly and hopefully have a greater sense of how to fine-tune some of the policy decisions that are made. That said, a lot of policy decisions are made for primarily U.S. domestic reasons. So, again, there's only so much that you can really claim to affect.
And I give you a different policy spin because we have clients in probably 60 countries around the world. So for me, policy is how do I interface with that person? So you have to wear a different kind of a thought hat, right? Because how you approach something with someone from Japan is different than someone from Brazil. How quick they want you to cut to the chase, how much groupthink they want you to do, how obliquely they want you to respond to something initially. Some places they like the brusque American, other places they hate it. So you really have to learn. I mean, it's an interaction policy, and I do agree also that it totally shapes yourself internally because I do a lot in Japan with a lot of Japanese companies, and I know that's to me influenced the way I think in some ways because of the approach that they take, the very methodical approach. But that is the policy for us. I mean, we always have to think about, we're talking to the guys in Sweden today. Well, it's very different than talking to the people from Mexico, and so it's it does shape you. It shapes you in your interfaces. That's why the whole notion of getting out there, and don't take a lesson learned in one country and presume it's going to apply elsewhere, because it's not. I mean, it's just, it never is. That's where I think it's been invaluable, because we do get exposed to a lot of things. So we try to take those lessons learned and apply them within the context of whatever nationality we might be dealing with.
Just to pick up on that, it really, in terms of looking at what's going on in terms of foreign policy and what's going on in the world, I think it really does, it really influences the way, at least I think, about significant issues that are domestic in nature, but they certainly affect foreign policy. Last year I was in Vietnam, and we had a meeting with the head of the Vietnamese Diplomatic Academy, and there's a really dynamic guy, really dynamic meeting, and so really good interchange. At the end of it, he said, "But I got one last question for you." And I said, "Well, yeah, sure." And he says, "What's your trade policy?" And he said, "Well, we're working on it." But that's a very critical issue in terms of how it affects this domestic issue, in terms of what happens in terms of jobs and everything else, the way it's played here. But it certainly affects our role and presence in East Asia. He was very direct. He said, "Look, we're about business here. We're about growing the economy. We're about providing for our people. And unless you're here and active on the ground, you're out of business." And this was very much, there's a whole range of issues that are affecting trade policy now that really affect our role and influence, at least to my mind, the Asia-Pacific region, and probably globally as well.
From reading your bios, it seems that all of you have very impressive qualifications in higher education, masters and PhDs and so on. And I was wondering what your take was on whether one should become, when you should be qualified, what sort of qualifications an undergraduate should think about, whether one should think about doing it before having career experience or trying to get career experience first.
Why don't I take a crack at that? When I was going through the college, for a variety of reasons, people didn't do the break between college and graduate school as much as they do now. Partly that was because there was a war going on, and people of my age who took a break didn't take a very long one. So that was the Vietnam War. Just to be clear, which war we're talking about. Civil War. Been in so many of them that. I think it is good to take a break of at least a year and perhaps do it abroad. It's a good time. You're flexible. You don't have many other responsibilities usually. There are the questions of student loans and so on. But I think it's a great time to reflect on where you are and where you're going. That said, it's increasingly difficult to get a job that has any substance to it at all without an MA at least. Now, the MA PhD break is a whole different matter. First of all, there's the enslavement of the PhD. There's the infantilization of it. There's the whole brouhaha about what it is to do a PhD. So that might be a longer, more serious thinking about what you want in your life and how much time you want to spend on education and so on and so forth. But an MA, I guess it's 6, so 1/2 dozen of the other, whether you take 2 years and do the MA or you take a break. And partly, I think it depends on how you feel after you're done with your 4 years. I mean, are you exhausted and would like to have a little bit of a break and between that time and the time you want to do your next academic thing, or you want to get finished with the academic thing and then take some time off? I think you could flip a coin about that. Personally, I wish I had had some time to between my undergraduate and graduate school to bum around and so on and so forth, but I didn't.
I did 2 years as a full-time intern here in Chicago as working in a residential program for recovering addicts and homeless men after I graduated from college. And that was part of the reason I got the grad degree I did in social service administration. It was very formative for me. I also saw a lot of people during the course of Peace Corps who thought they were going to go one direction, and after 2 years of Peace Corps service ended up going a completely different one. And for me, sitting in a classroom, I liked having the ability to test the theory that I was hearing with the reality that I had already experienced trying to implement it. So I really enjoyed having had some practical experience to say, that's an interesting idea, but that's not how it seemed like when I was doing X. And it's tough to do that when you go straight through. So for me, at least, I really enjoyed having the practical experience first. But I had a lot of colleagues and cohorts that had gone straight through and really enjoyed the ability to just plow on through and layer on some of the thinking that they had already developed as undergraduates. So I really think you can do it either way. But for me, my preference is the same as yours.
I think the PhD is a whole different question. That's a much longer, long-term commitment, 4, 5, 6 years, deeply engaged, etc. The MA, I would do it for many of the reasons you just said.
Yeah.
I also think it depends how practical of a master's degree you're looking for. If it's something that is really, a real world type of a degree you're pursuing, then the time off's invaluable. To Cliff's point about being able to look at things from a real world perspective as opposed to the academic perspective, then that experience is you can't substitute for that real experience.
If I could make a technical comment there, and that is, again, State Department, Foreign Service, the only requirements are that you have to be a U.S. citizen and you have to be 21 years old, and you have to pass the exam. So there are no direct educational requirements whatsoever. That said, I suspect that there's a correlation between how much higher education you've had and how likely you are to pass the exam. Certainly a lot of my colleagues, and there are a sprinkling of PhDs, many people with masters. I would say relatively fewer with a BA or less, but it isn't technically required.
I have more of a policy question for Mr. Sandrolini. It said in your bio that you were currently working on a international narcotics panel of sorts, and I was wondering what you saw as the future of kind of domestic drug policy here in the U.S. and internationally, with the success that Portugal has had recently, and just kind of where you saw that policy going.
It's a good point because the bureau that I work with, one of the bureaus of the State Department, and I have not made a career out of this. I move around from one to another, but for several years I've been working in the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, or INL as it's known. And that started as a strictly anti-narcotics bureau, and it was primarily in Latin America. And many of its best-known programs, Colombia, now Mexico, they were in Bolivia as well. They were very much counter-drug. In the last 10 years or so, and particularly in the last few, with the Iraq and Afghanistan wars as large drivers of this, INL is actually much more doing rule of law work, and that's where I am now. So I'm not actually doing counter-narcotics work. Doesn't mean I don't have opinions about it, but I would just say a moment about the rule of law work is that I consider it very exciting. My most recent overseas assignment was in Jerusalem, where I spent 2 years managing a $400 million program supporting Palestinian rule of law by involving corrections, prosecutors, police, building things for them, buying things for them, but also training and doing a lot of ground-up reorganizing, capacity building. I think that's very exciting. I think it's going to be the wave of the future in a lot of post-conflict societies. That's the way that the State Department is beginning to organize itself in terms of, and not only state, but how do we approach societies in Africa, in the Caribbean, in Asia that seem to be destined, for the short term at least, to a lot of conflict, a lot of broken societies where things don't work anymore. INL is the part of the State. The State Department is the lead U.S. government agency for foreign affairs, and INL is that arm of the State Department that deals with law enforcement and narcotics work. For example, AID, and maybe Jerry can say more about this, does quite a bit with rule of law, but in different areas, sort of the sometimes referred to as the hard side or the soft side. We do the criminal justice part. AID will work more with judges, with the Bar Association, public defenders, judicial training, things of that sort. So there are definitely more than one U.S. government agency involved in that. I think it's a very big issue. None of that has to do with your question about drugs. I'm not really, I haven't been involved in drug policy for a number of years, so I don't really know if it's fair for me to comment on that. But come and see me afterwards if you want. I'd be happy to talk about it.
This question is particularly for those of you that work from more of an academic standpoint or advising in terms of think tanks or just advice to officials. How would you say that your work affects, and if it does, if it affects policy decision-making, particularly in Washington, like the talks that you give or the papers that you give out or the people that you speak to?
Well, the Institute for National Strategic Studies is a rather unique think tank because it has both a public face and a policy face that faces the government inward. I can think of a number of papers that we've written that in effect became policy. Back in 2000, we published a report on the U.S.-Japan relationship, and Mr. Armitage, who became Deputy Secretary of State in the first Bush administration, the head of the Japan desk told me afterwards that basically Rich came in and said, "Okay, here's the policy. Put it in a State Department paper. We're ready to go." So yes, we've had some real impact. And on another issue with regarding South Korea and the U.S. ROK alliance, the Institute served as a informal policy planning staff for a lot of the talks that went on between the two governments. So we were able to shape issues and present them to the negotiators in a way that they could influence ultimately policy direction. And we've been unsuccessful in other instances as well. That's for sure. Back in beginning of the 1990s, the first North Korean nuclear crisis took off. I was involved in that. And now at the Institute, I'm still involved with that. And I can say we've been very unsuccessful in dealing with that issue.
I think that's a government think tank. That is to say, it's supported by U.S. government. Its funds come from U.S. government, et cetera. Get other grants and so on. But the think tank I'm now with is a private one, and so it depends a lot on grants and funding streams from outside the government, but also from inside the government. I think there's two answers to the question. A week from today, I'll be boarding a plane to Azerbaijan to do a 3-week assessment for the U.S. government, for AID in particular, on its democracy governance program status and what could be done to increase the rule of law and other areas of democratic performance and good governance. That report will go to the U.S. government. And so what happens after that is anybody's guess, I would say. It will be the aid program put forward. Whether that program looks exactly like what we recommend or not, I'm not so sure. And then what happens to it when it goes through the various iterations inside the government, and that gets to the question about the personal policy thing as well. You're in a huge government, which has 3 branches, and even within the executive branch has multiple agencies, et cetera, et cetera. So the policy that comes out is a whole series of considerations and compromises and all that kind of thing. So any individual's impact, unless you wrote the long telegram of Kennan, is probably not as great as one might hope. But I think there are two, to get a more theoretical answer, I think there's 2 ways in which some of the external think tanks can affect things. First, the person who's out of government now may be in government especially as a political, in the next administration. So that's one dimension of influence, what happens in the next administration. The second is this kind of Azerbaijan project, where you're asked to do something, it goes into the government sausage machine, and how it comes out is a function of all kinds of compromises, et cetera, et cetera. I wouldn't go if I didn't think it was going to have an impact. I think it will. How big an impact and how high a level and so on is, that's a whole series of circumstances and influences and people and organizations that affect that. And that's true all the way through. If you write an interesting cable from the field, how impactful is that likely to be? Depends on who reads it, what they do with it, how it's received, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of, it's a big place. And so the impact of any one stone that's thrown into that pond is can be pretty good, can be pretty direct, and can be also quite diffuse, I would say.
Just to follow on that, you think on the day-to-day operational environment, a lot of these think tanks produce many papers, et cetera. They really don't affect, to my mind, at least in my experience, the day-to-day decisions that I made. But they are part of a broader political debate that really shapes where policy can go. And that's why they are important, because they're part of an ongoing conversation in Washington across the political spectrum in terms of where we should be going and how we should be getting there. And they do, because they are very political. They have an effect on policy ultimately.
We've got about 15 minutes left, so I want to keep questions coming. Come on up.
So I know a few of you work in international development and some work in international relations. So I'm wondering, what are, in your view, the overarching goals of international development or international relations, and how has your personal career contributed to those?
It's a big question.
Wow.
Well, I was at USAID, so that may be the most direct agency on the international development side, although, as Chris has said, INL, all kinds of places within state have assistance dimensions to them. The purpose, I think there are two elements that people need to keep in mind, and unfortunately, I think only one sometimes is on each side in development. One has to do with what is it, and do we know what it is that will help a country or a sub-part of the country at least move ahead on a whole variety of indices that together you might call development. Economic growth and so on is one element of it. There's a political element, a health element, all kinds of elements to it. However, the other side has to do with U.S. interests. I mean, we're not just there out of eleemosynary drives, although I think that's sometimes underestimated, the extent to which the U.S. government does things because it wants to make a better world. It's not all self-directing U.S. interests. However, there are definitely U.S. interests involved in all of these countries, and they form a foundation against which these development decisions are made. Sometimes more, sometimes less. Depends to some extent, for example, on the geopolitical significance of the country that you're looking at. The recommendations in Russia are going to be taken differently, probably on the development side, than the recommendations in Malawi, where the interest of the U.S. in Malawi is just not as great as the U.S. interest is in Russia, and neither are the competing interests between the development side, for example, and business, trade, investment, defense, et cetera, as they are in a place like Russia. So that international relations is a bigger basket that includes the development basket, but a lot of these other elements as well. And that's what state is the leading agency, and defense are the leading agencies by and large to do. But commerce, as was said earlier, I forgot who said it, there's all kinds of agencies that are now in the international development and international relations basket that didn't used to be 20 years ago. And not only that, but just one last thing on the QDDR that Chris mentioned, more and more international development and international relations are in the private sector. They're in the business sector, they're in the NGO sector, they're in all kinds of things like that. And the total amount of official development assistance is the technical name for this, ODA, the amount of budget money appropriated by Congress and spent by U.S. government agencies abroad to do assistance is dwarfed by foreign direct investment, by philanthropical projects, charities, World Learning, this, that, and the next, all kinds of NGOs. The NGO sector, the Gates people, and with Buffett have changed the paradigm a lot. There's just a whole lot of, there are a lot more players in it than there were 20 years ago.
Margaret, can you maybe give some thoughts from your perspective as a strictly non-governmental development organization?
Yeah, well, because of what we do is fundamentally fundraising and then placing those dollars abroad, we are tied to what donors want to fund. And donors are going to be driven by international relations and policy. We take a lot of money from USAID less than we used to, but all of that is going to shape, how are we going to cause or create better outcomes in the field, because we have to raise the dollars that are out there. So donors want to fund a specific kind of project, then you might have to build that into your next proposal so that you can access the dollars, unleash the potential of whoever it is you're trying to help. So for us in particular, microfinance, but over time, the dollars are less just general microfinance, and we've moved into new initiatives that run into education, into healthcare. So, and a lot of that is driven by, the Gates Foundation is now interested in health. So we're going to look at what kind of financial products can we develop that are going to overlap with the health sector, and how can we tap into those donor dollars to make it happen. So yeah, it's all tied together, even though for us, at least, our eyes are always on serving the poor, reaching lower, finding new ways to meet the needs that are currently unmet or underrepresented in our market. So, yeah.
So having a passion for one's profession is something that's extremely important. What would you say is the most exciting or fulfilling aspect of working in foreign services?
For me, it was meeting clients. So when I go to the field to do monitoring and evaluation projects, or just to kick off, a new project, I actually get to go and meet the people that take the loans, open the savings account, that have a story to tell about, my husband was sick and I had enough income from my business, which has grown over time because of the loans given by your organization, and we could buy the medicine that saved his life. And, it's stuff like that. And I think microfinance always gets kind of a bad rap sometimes because so much of it is anecdotal. It's very hard to track actual impact and say, oh man, for every dollar that I've loaned this person, their income has increased, twofold. It's not always as straightforward as that, because you're looking at individual people, and maybe you aren't going to impact their bottom line, so to speak, and they're not going to be millionaires tomorrow, but maybe overall they have more of what they need out of life, whether or not, it's sending their child to school, or they can buy more meat to put on the table. It's all kinds of different things. So, but for me, it's always when you get to go in the field and see your projects in action and helping, it's really meaningful.
Earlier this week, I facilitated a staging here in Chicago for a group of about 30 folks that were getting on a plane to go to the Gambia for 2 years as Peace Corps volunteers. And for me, as someone who works early in the recruitment phase, I spend a lot of time with folks that are just starting to consider Peace Corps, to see someone who's moved through that application process and is getting ready to go have the 27 months that I've had before, although every experience is completely unique, to know how much their perspectives are going to change and how much the perspectives of their community members are going to change, and what happens during an average Peace Corps stint. It's incredibly rewarding to know that there are folks like yourselves that are passionate not just about a career in international development, but about making a difference and about service to people who are really interested in the skills you have and interested in partnering with you to make change for themselves. So that's incredibly rewarding for me, and it makes me optimistic every time I see it.
I'd make a real brief comment, and that's I've been lucky enough to have a lot of fun things, meeting important people and seeing cool places and so forth, and that's all been great. But really, the thing that moves me the most consistently is something that my fellow panelists have already been speaking about, and that's, for me, turning abstractions into concrete realities. In other words, if you take something like HIV/AIDS, when you're working in a country and you're directly involved in programs that are dealing with HIV/AIDS, it starts to take on a real a feeling that's much different than when you're talking about it at an abstract level. And the same for programs against hunger or crime. In my most recent job, for instance, I was visiting prisons and helping to build them, and talking to police about their issues. I found that my foreign service career has brought me into contact with an incredible variety of ways of life that I never would have. I never would have hoped to meet a corrections officer otherwise. But I can say that I've learned a lot from them. It's very, very interesting, and that multiplied in many different ways. And of course, with international aspects to that, has been a wonderful thing for me. And it's, in other words, helped me feel closer to people all around the world by being able to better understand what things affect their lives.
Yeah, one quick point on that. I think, from my perspective, what I've always found energizing in terms of what I've done is, you're trying to shape policy, and you have a sense of vision of where you think should be going, and to be able to successfully persuade, key decision makers that this is the way to go. That's extremely rewarding. And I think that's what really makes me go every day. I say, boy, I got a chance to try and think this through, make the argument, make the case, and then we'll see what happens. But that's what I find really rewarding.
All right, we got 5 minutes left. This is going to be our last question.
My question is from both a grassroots level and from more of a diplomatic level. What types of people do you see yourselves working with on a regular basis, and what types of skills for your level do you recommend having for negotiating and being able to work with these different individuals?
My take on that is it's a pretty broad field. Primarily, I've spent my time with other professionals, either other people within an embassy or within the State Department, or people in a host government that I talk to, but not exclusively. And again, for me at least, I've loved the opportunities to get out and about and precisely push against those boundaries. In Slovakia, I did economic work, and I visited many kinds of factories, and I learned a lot about how things are made and how they made their decisions, transitioning out of a socialist economy into a capitalist economy. I've done different things around the world, but if you push, you can get out of the mostly bureaucratic, mostly professional surroundings that you normally find yourself in as a diplomat, and really, and this is especially true in the conflict areas like Iraq and Afghanistan, where the U.S. government is attempting to rebuild entire societies in some ways, out there doing agricultural extension work and talking about civil society and working to reduce gender violence and so forth, getting out there and meeting people in refugee camps. There are all kinds of people that you can get out, and the more you do that, the more that it will inform the otherwise dry-seeming policy recommendations that we make.
I would tell you that there's no one answer, because every experience is going to expose you to somebody different in a different capacity. So I think the biggest thing is to have a healthy enough ego to say when you don't know something and not try to bluff your way through the situation. I mean, we deal with people, all different types of functions within an organization or in government agencies or other requirements or longshoremen or whatever it might be in my capacity. A lot of people, I didn't have a similar growing up, background. You just have to be smart enough to be humble enough to say, oh, I didn't know that, or to learn from those people. Like, I'm guessing your corrections officer experience was a whole new world for you. So don't think you need to prove something to someone. I mean, it's more that you are engaged and you're trying to learn and trying to help. That carries a lot more weight than trying to bluff your way through a situation.
I work day to day with people who live in other countries. So a lot of it's being patient and trying to communicate, openly, gain trust. But for me, I earned my reputation amongst the different banks that I work with because they know that I'm a hard worker. If they come and they ask me and they need help or they need money, they know that I am going to turn around and fix it for them and get it done. So a lot of what you do in a partnership, if you make the commitments to people, you have to follow through and you have to, be on the same page with them. So for us in particular, because we work with, the U.S. office, I will work with my banks that we own, but we also have implementing teams that go out and do kind of consulting, if you will, on various projects. So I have to negotiate with them. I have to negotiate with all my donors. I have to we work on consortiums on a lot of projects. So I work with other NGOs. Some of that even can be, the government of Malawi, for instance. I do a lot of work with them. So you have to be kind of open, friendly, responsive. So it's, you pick up the skills as you go along. And as you said earlier, picking up the cultural nuances and, learning the best way to talk to each kind of group of people and keeping in mind what you're trying to accomplish and knowing that you want it to be a mutually beneficial relationship. So I'm trying to do this, you're trying to do this, we're on the same page, let's, get it done and do it. So.
Just one quick thing. I think to some extent, although people go back and forth between these two, you need to make a distinction between the people who are actually on the ground, hands-on working, and those, at least for the U.S. government, tend to be NGOs and for-profits. They are not the U.S. government official. The U.S. government official is not going to go out there day in, day out working with person X, person Y, and person Z. You're at a much more abstract, higher level, if you like, but what I mean by higher level is more policy-oriented. What should we be doing? Meaning, what should U.S. resources be doing? Who does it is a whole other matter, and it's usually, at least in the assistance programs, and it's more NGOs and for-profits that are doing this on a day-by-day basis. It's not the U.S. government official. So if you want to be out there hands-on working with people like Margaret does, you need to be in an NGO. Yep. Don't be in the U.S. government. If you want to work on policy about what should be done, then you should be in the U.S. government, but don't think you're going to be out there every day working with, Jomo so-and-so or whoever it is, because you're not. You're going to be writing memos, processing them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is, if you like, a strategic choice where you want to be. Don't expect to do one thing if you're in the other category. That said, people do move back and forth between them, and in part through the political process. Yeah.
All right. I think that's a good point to end. Thank you guys so much for joining us.